Every day, the toll of Russia's attacks on Ukraine becomes more evident and heartbreaking. It is a humanitarian crisis of terrible proportions. It is also, according to Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, an attack on the global order. Bob Rae is our UN ambassador, and he joins us now from Manhattan, New York. Ambassador, it's great to see you again. I want to just start by asking what somebody like you does at a moment like this. There are countries at war. You're an ambassador of a NATO member. What do you actually do now to try to help?
Well, we talk to as many people as possible. We try to build bridges. We try to establish lines of communication and conversation. And we do our very best to remind everybody that there will be no winners in this thing. There will only be losers. So we have to figure out a way to get to a place where people can start talking about what a settlement might look like. Unfortunately, I have to say that I think that President Putin's comments on the fact that he doesn't see the peace process going anywhere and he's not interested in carrying on, and every indication that we see from our intelligence and any information that the Russians are preparing for some massive military attacks in the east and south of the country are only terrible news, because it's going to mean that we'll see a lot of really bad, dark things happening, as we have over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And it's very tough, but we have to keep trying. And there are lots of other people who are also trying, and that's what we have to do right now.
I understand that you have to keep trying, but do the developments therefore mean that you have different advice for the government of Canada in terms of what we ought to be doing right now? And by that I mean something tougher.
Well, I think my advice would not be alone. I think there's a lot of people who made it very clear. I noticed that President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson have had some meetings talking about how they have to make sure that Ukraine is getting the equipment that it needs. In our budget last week, Chrystia Freeland announced that we're going to be providing more weaponry to the Ukrainians. Minister Anand is in the UK this week. I'm sure that's part of the conversation. And yes, we need to make sure that Ukraine has the weapons that it needs to be able to defend itself in this terrible act of aggression, which has been launched by President Putin. So we have to keep doing that, but it doesn't mean that you stop listening to whatever you can hear about what possibilities there might be. And at the UN, those kinds of conversations happen pretty well 24 hours a day. We don't get a lot of sleep here, Steve.
Well, you look remarkably good for a guy who hasn't had enough sleep lately. So,
and who's 73 years old, and it's just amazing. I just attended a conference on ageism this afternoon, so I had several things to say about that.
I'll bet. Tell me this, though, and again, as we try to get more insight into what it is that you're able to do right now, do you have a relationship with your counterpart from Russia, and do you talk to him or her on a regular basis? I don't even know. Who is it?
Ambassador Valencia, I haven't talked to him in the last little while. I think our critical conversations with the Russians obviously take place in Moscow. I do have several conversations with people on the Ukrainian side and also at the UN. Really, what we're trying to find out now from the UN is what kind of dialogue can be held with the Russians to deal with humanitarian matters. And that is a critical conversation which is taking place. The Secretary General has been engaging in those conversations, and I have a good link in with him. I'll be seeing a couple of people at dinner tonight that I hope I'll be able to carry on some good conversations about what more might be done with the it's sort of one of these working dinners that we have from on a regular basis, where we just sit down and talk about what more can we do. And that, I think, there are a lot of missions that have a very key role here. Obviously the United States, the UK, our NATO allies, but also Turkey, which is a country that's had a lot to do with getting the peace talks going and moving. And they have excellent conversations on both sides. We do have a lot of work that's been ongoing with the Ukrainians on what a solution might look like Um, but I think with the Russians, right now it's more difficult because they've made a determination that they're going to go to war, they're going to stay with the war approach, and that makes it much harder. So you end up saying, okay, that's their decision. Then we have to be prepared to push back very hard on that front. If the Russians are saying our preferred path is not peace, but our preferred path is war, then we have to make sure that the Ukrainians are totally equipped to be able to fight that war effectively.
Okay, I'm going to go on a bit of a limb here, and you tell me if I'm all wet on this. But unlike you, who I think your prime minister listens to, my hunch would be that Vladimir Putin doesn't listen to or care what his UN ambassador is doing or saying to anybody else. He's calling all the shots. So do you have these moments where you think you're talking to a wall when you're talking to your counterpart from Russia?
Um, I don't want to break all lines of communication, so I'm only going to say I think there's a lot of public commentary about the degree of isolation of the Russian president. I have no other information that would lead me to think otherwise. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay, moving on. You know, of course, that the United Nations has been criticized for decades and decades for what people wish it could do but hasn't been able to do or whatever. And part of its job, obviously, is to maintain international peace. And some people are going to say they haven't done a very good job at doing that so far. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think the founders of the UN didn't give it the means to play the role that everybody wants it to play. And that's one of the tragedies of our time, is the UN does not have an army. The UN does not have a military capacity. All the UN can do is persuade. The Secretary General can only do what countries are willing to let him do. And the notion that somehow the United Nations as an institution is going to be able to exercise military force against somebody who's behaving like an aggressor, or is going to somehow be able to magically get people into a room and get them to do a deal is illusory, because the UN doesn't have military power. It doesn't have the means to force countries to do what would be necessary in the interest of peace. So I get the frustration, but I also think it's fair to say that Richard Holbrooke was right when he said that you don't blame Madison Square Gardens every time the Knicks lose. And I think that's the same thing true of the UN. You don't blame the UN because member states are behaving terribly and because member states are not listening to logic, and member states are going to war. And this is a situation where one member state is carrying out an act of aggression against another, and many, many countries are going to the aid and to the defense of Ukraine in its efforts to withstand this onslaught of the Russian army and the Russian Air Force and the Russian Navy. But the idea that somehow the UN would magically solve this problem is, you say, well, how would you think that would happen? There is a reality here that we have to continually check up against, and that is the reality that the UN has never had the military force behind it that would allow it to enforce a peace. All it can do is rely on member states to supply it with the means to create the peace. And at different times in history, in Korea, when basically the UN, under the leadership of the United States, went to war in order to defend the Republic of Korea. We went into peacekeeping, thanks to Mr. Pearson's initiative, because the United States told the British and the French to back off. And what were you thinking? And told the Israelis the same thing and said, what are you thinking of when you think you can land at Suez Canal and somehow pretend that you're not invading when you are invading? So that was able to be effective. We've been able to keep a truce in Cyprus for the last 50 years, which has kept the two sides apart and kept them from fighting. But I can also list longer than my arm the things that the UN has not been able to do. For example, 2 weeks ago, we were able to bring about a settlement of a ceasefire in Yemen, which has lasted so far. Let's hope it keeps on. but at the same time, we've not been able to stop the fighting in Ukraine. And even a modicum of humanitarian movement of population in order to allow people to get out from under Mariupol, that has not been permitted by the Russians. So we're dealing with a ruthless and sadly permanent member of the Security Council, when the whole purpose of the Security Council and the whole purpose of the permanent membership was that you would have 5 countries that would together agree that they would keep the peace. That was the deal. And that's the deal that the Russians have broken. Russians have not kept the peace. The Russians have become the aggressor. And that's what's caused the war. And that's why we're fighting. That's why, and why it's against the world order is because food prices, food availability, energy prices, energy availability, everything has been shot to hell because of what the Russians have done. And there's going to be massive famines in many parts of the world. There's going to be potentially riots in the street in countries all over the world because you're going to have food prices out of sight. You're going to have energy prices out of sight. And the poorest countries in the world are going to be devastated by the impact of what the Russians have done. What they've done is criminal.
Well, let me pick up on that because there's tremendous support for Ukraine right now, particularly in the West. But one wonders how long or how deep that support will last if, in fact, food prices double, if, in fact, the price of gasoline continues to go up. How concerned are you about that?
Well, it's not Ukraine's fault. I mean, Ukraine has been attacked. They're not cutting. I mean, they can't get their products to market because the Russians are blocking it on the Black Sea. They can't plant their seeds which are vital for food production all over the Middle East and all over North Africa and many other parts of the world. They can't do it because the Russians are preventing the farmers from planting seeds. There's a war going on. But it's not a war that's been created or caused or initiated by Ukraine. It's a war that has been created and caused by Russia. There's only one country that's responsible for this conflict.
Mm-hmm. Let me just circle back to something you said a moment ago when you did say that there were many countries that were going to bat for Ukraine right now. And I hasten to point out there are many countries that have not gone to bat for Ukraine right now. I note that barely any countries in Asia have supported the sanctions regime. I don't know that any countries in Africa are supporting sanctions. I don't know that very many countries in Latin America are supporting sanctions. Why do you think it seems to be at the moment just the West, and certainly NATO countries, but mostly the West, that have been prepared to do this, and much of the rest of the world has not got on board?
I think that's a little overdone. We got 140 votes in favor of the 2 resolutions that clearly analyzed the cause of the conflict.
That called Russia the aggressor, but that are not participating in sanctions. You haven't got 140 countries on sanctions.
No, that's correct. That's true, and there are very real reasons for that. Some of them are very poor. Some of them are very vulnerable. Some of them are either partly financially or otherwise dependent on Russia or on China. And I think that behind the scenes, China has not been particularly helpful with a number of countries in warning them that if they go too far in terms of joining with the coalition against Russia, that there's going to be a problem. But look, I mean, this is not new. This is not dramatically different from anything we've seen before. There are a great many countries that don't like sanctions. There are a great many countries that are reluctant to participate in them. They don't participate in sanctions on Iran. They don't participate in sanctions on Myanmar. They don't participate in sanctions on many countries where the West has come to the conclusion that short of military intervention, which we have not done in Myanmar and we've not done in Iran, but short of military intervention, sanctions are the only set of tools we have in the toolbox. And they're not perfect and they're not always effective, but there are many other countries which don't agree. I mean, that's the state of the world today. We don't have a general consensus in the world today about how we're going to be able to address these kinds of issues. And that makes it difficult, but it doesn't make it impossible. The fact is sanctions have had more of an impact on Russia than I think Russia ever believed. The military support for Ukraine and the resilience and the technical and professional ability of the Ukrainian military at every level has shocked the Russians, as it should have. And I think it's a revelation to everybody to see to what extent Ukraine has been able to turn what Russia thought would be a 3-day blitzkrieg into a major ongoing war, which, in my view, Russia cannot be allowed to win.
I want to take you back, I guess, a few weeks. You made a speech at the United Nations and you brandished your charter. And boy, oh boy, that thing got a lot of pickup on social media. There were a lot of people who either emailed me or called me or whatever and said, you know, go Bob, go. He's speaking for us. I want to know, and you got out, if I can say this, you got out a little ahead of the government of Canada in calling evil what it is. And I want to know whether you had any brushback from the Prime Minister's office or Foreign Affairs Canada, Global Affairs Canada, that you might be just a little ahead of where our politicians wanted us to be at that moment.
Not at all. I've had nothing but support from the government of Canada, and nothing but support from Global Affairs Canada, from the ministers, from the Minister of Defense, from Minister Joly, from Minister Sajjan in Development, who I've met with a couple of times. The Prime Minister personally has been extremely supportive, personally to me. He's phoned me, he's talked to me. We're in regular contact, and he's very supportive. I mean, I'm chuckling because you might think that would be what would happen, but not at all. I think, in fact, and I've had nothing but positive reaction from many of my fellow diplomats in the Canadian Foreign Service. I've had very positive comments from my colleagues in different capitals, most of them professional diplomats, and they just say you're doing a wonderful job in using the UN, which is what it should be used for, which is a platform to explain to the world and to explain to Canadians what's going on, what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and using public diplomacy for what it should be used for, as well as private diplomacy. And of course, public diplomacy involves using social media and other ways of communicating, and I do that. And I don't feel any sense that my leash is being pulled or that I'm being muzzled, or quite the opposite. I don't even this interview, Steve. I don't, as you, in contrast to some of your other people on your program, I don't have notes. I don't have briefers telling me don't say this, say that. I just do the programs and I just talk. And at the age of 73, I think I know what I'm doing. And the Prime Minister has demonstrated nothing but confidence in what I'm doing. And I'm delighted that he is.
Let me ask you one more question. And admittedly, this is a bit of a touchy-feely one. But 50 years ago, your dad had the job you now have. I wonder, when you're out there doing your work today, how often you think of him.
Every day.
Is it helpful?
Always. I mean, you can see you always do this to me, Steve. You manage to touch a chord that kind of gets me. But as you know, my dad was born in Hamilton.
I sure do know.
I
think on New Year's Eve, actually.
That's an additional connection that you and I have together, and there are many others. But no, my dad was a career diplomat who cared a lot about Canada and was a very lucky guy. He came from a very poor family and got a scholarship to U of T, and then a scholarship to go to the LSE, and then a scholarship to go to Oxford. He's a very successful guy academically and everything. And when the war broke out, he went into the Foreign Service, and that was his life. So for him, being able to serve at the UN in Geneva and then in New York was a wonderful opportunity. And I know that, I went to high school in Geneva. I went to international school. I know that many people thought I was an awkward fit to be the leader of the New Democrats in Ontario. But there you go. It worked out in a way that I was allowed for us to form a government. We can debate that on another occasion, as Mr. Davis would have said. And then to come here, to come full circle, has been a wonderful opportunity. And I think of him and my mother a lot. And it's very meaningful because there's a lot of history that I have in my head that I can relate to people to say, we've been through this before. This is what happened before. And people look at me and say, how do you know that? I said, I just know it. I know what happened. It's part of my story, part of who I am. So I feel that I can do this job with great confidence and with great affection, with thinking of my my mom and dad, and thinking of what they stood for, what they went through in their lives, going through World War II, and coming through the Depression, and all that greatest. Tom Brokaw called them the greatest generation. They were a remarkable generation. So for me to be able to follow, if you like, in his footsteps, and those who know me will know that there was some times when I fought back against doing that, and now finally kind of come around to the conclusion that this is what makes sense for me. So I'm very proud to be able to do it as a Canadian.
Well, as I guess they said to President Truman 70 or 80 years ago, give him hell, Harry, okay? Keep doing it.
Giving him hell. They call me Hurricane Bob here.
Good. All right. Ambassador, I know how crazy your time is these days, so we're grateful you could spare some time for us on TVO tonight. Thank you and be well.
Very glad to do it. Nice to talk to you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.